Well, hey, everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to today's show. Now, last week, a bipartisan bill was introduced, and it's a mouthful. It's called the Finding Orphan-disease Remedies with Antifungal Research and Development Act, or the Forward Act of 2021. Now, this legislation, introduced by members of the Congressional Valley Fever Task Force, is designed to address challenges related to detecting, treating, and ultimately eliminating valley fever by incentivizing antifungal therapeutics and vaccine development. Well, joining me today to talk about valley fever and the Forward Act is John Galgiani, MD. Dr. Galgiani is a professor of medicine, and he's the director of the Valley Fever Centers for Excellence at the University of Arizona. Dr. Galgiani, welcome to the show, sir.
Hey, good morning. Nice to meet with you, Robert.
Now, it's actually been a while since I did a podcast or an interview on Valley Fever. So I'd like to go ahead and have a sort of thorough discussion about Valley Fever so the audience is aware. I know it's really a regional type of disease. So us out here in the East Coast like to learn about it. So
Yeah.
Dr. Galgiani, what is Valley Fever?
So you're right. It's a regional disease that really only exists in the Western Hemisphere. And in the United States, it's mostly in the Western United States, in fact, exclusively west of the Mississippi, and most intensely in Arizona and in certain parts of California. And it's a fungal infection. What makes it regional is that the fungus grows in the soil of only certain places. The Sonoran deserts around Tucson and Phoenix, for example, are very ideal for its growth. Also, the dry areas around Bakersfield in the southern Central Valley of California. In fact, Valley fever got its name from the San Joaquin Valley, not the Valley of the Sun in Arizona. It causes infections in a number of mammals, including humans. And you get infected if the spores, which grow in the dirt, break off and become airborne. If you inhale one of these spores, it establishes an infection by the pulmonary route. And what happens after that is widely divergent. 2 out of 3 people who get infected don't know it. They have no illness sufficient to go to a doctor, and they get over it without any symptoms, and then they're immune for the rest of their life. So that's very good news. A third of patients who get infected typically get a pneumonia, which isn't surprising since you get infected through your lungs, but it can also involve aches and pains and rashes. A synonym of valley fever is desert rheumatism, because those symptoms can be very spectacular. And that illness, even if it's not treated, also eventually goes away in most people, but it takes weeks to months most of the time. And so it's surprisingly highly impacting, even though it's a self-limited disease. And those people are also immune for the rest of their life. A small percentage of infections actually have much more complicated courses. They either have chronic lung infections, which are progressive, or the infection goes through the bloodstream to other parts of the body and causes infections in bones or skin or even meningitis. That's obviously not good and makes people very sick, and they become much more familiar with their doctors as a result. And treatments for that exist, but they don't cure this disease. And typically, courses of treatment for that lasts years to lifetime. So it's a wide spectrum. Even the rare forms of this disease are pretty common here, because we think there's at least 150,000 new infections in the southwestern United States every year. 2/3 of that is in my state, in Arizona. In fact, people who live in Phoenix, their disease is 1/2 of all U.S. infections is in the greater metropolitan Phoenix area. So it's very intensely here. 1 out of 3 pneumonias in our part of the country is due to valley fever, this fungus. And if you travel to Arizona from Tampa, for example, and you come back and get sick with a pneumonia in the first month after visiting the Grand Canyon State, your chances that it's due to valley fever is just the same as it is for people who live here. So there's reasons for even people on the East Coast and in the Southeast to know about this disease, even though it's really much more localized to California, Arizona. There are little pockets in Utah. West Texas has it. Southeastern Washington has actually identified a little pocket. So it's gaining more evidence for it elsewhere around the western United States, but the big areas of endemicity are south central Arizona and the Central Valley and Southern California area.
So how bad has it been this year in, say, Arizona, where you're at?
It's been quite significant, and it's actually earlier this year it was on par with being up there with the highest recorded year, which was 2011, where we had 16,000 cases reported. So if you did the math that I just kind of went through before, we think maybe 50,000 people get an illness and seek medical attention, but it's underdiagnosed. Doctors often don't test for this. It's a laboratory diagnosis. Patients look into, you can't really tell them from bacterial pneumonia or COVID, for example. And we recently did some studies on people admitted to hospitals with a pneumonia suspected to be COVID, and were tested for both cocci and COVID. Cocci is slang for coccidioidomycosis. Nobody wants to say coccidioidomycosis, so hence cocci. And what we found was if you test for both valley fever and COVID, four cases that turn out to have COVID infection, an additional patient is diagnosed with cocci. So it's very common. And COVID hopefully is going to go away, but cocci is going to stay with us year in and year out. So I don't know if the rise in 2021 is because there's more testing going on because patients are hospitalized with pneumonia, and then the tests for valley fever are done more frequently, or whether there's some year-to-year variation that means just more testing, more diagnoses.
Yeah. Is there any person-to-person transmission?
No, that's very good news. This is different from tuberculosis. It is an infectious disease, but it's not a transmissible disease. So people who get a diagnosis of valley fever are at no risk to the people around them. And that's why they don't need to be isolated, and we don't quarantine people.
Yeah. You went over a lot of the symptoms already. But obviously the most serious, well, maybe it's not obvious. The most serious situation is when it's disseminated. Is that correct?
Well, a few people get pneumonia that's overwhelming, but in general, you're right. That disseminated establishes destructive infections in these other parts of your body, and if that happens to occur on the lining of your brain, the meninges, causing meningitis, that's lethal if it's untreated. And fortunately, we now do have treatments, but before the 1960s, it was uniformly fatal, and the other forms of valley fever sometimes are waxing and waning, or as I said, many of the people who get pneumonia get over it and never have a problem with it again. But the people who get disseminated disease often get collapses of their vertebrae, so that's not good. They can have knee joints infected, big abscesses. So even if it doesn't kill you, it makes life pretty miserable.
In the disseminated infection, it's primarily seen in immunocompromised folks.
Well, that's not true. Actually, immunocompromised makes you much more susceptible to this. Mm-hmm. So if you are immunocompromised, such as an organ transplant, AIDS, a big issue these days is people on Humira or other biologic response modifiers.
Right.
And we're interested in to what extent that causes risk of bad valley fever. But in fact, if you look at who gets bad valley fever, the large majority are not immunocompromised patients, because most people aren't immunocompromised, and the statistics just run that there's more people that are normal that get bad valley fever because there are more people that are normal.
Now, something I read that was kind of interesting, I was hoping you have an answer. Um, I read it in CDC website and on your website that African Americans and Filipinos have a higher risk of disseminated infection. Do we know why?
Well, we think it is simply differences in what we call immunogenetics, or the genetics of the immune response. Um, Self-declared ancestry, African American, for example, is has something to do with genetics, but it's really a very poor genetic marker. We are admixtures of all sorts of things,
True.
as we've all learned. If we've been, had our DNA sent to one of the companies that will tell you your ancestry. But in fact, we're very interested in the genetics of why some people get disseminated disease, and it does seem like there are people who have an immune response to the infection that is just not adequate to control it, or maybe it doesn't control it fast enough so that the cat gets out of the bag, that the dissemination develops, and that's what our current thinking is. And it's possible that many of those genetic differences are more frequent in people of African descent. But these are very subtle differences, and it's not seen very often, in fact, rarely in families. So it's not like one mutation in one gene. What the evidence is that it's probably the cooperation of two or more genes in complex genetic ways that makes a pathway of those genes not work so well. And we're working with our friends at NIH and with an active research program here at the Valley Fever Center in the College of Medicine in Tucson to try to understand that. And if we could understand that better, we'd be able to have a test which could say, if you ever got valley fever, you're in risk of having this thing really be a problem.
Right.
And that might be very valuable.
Well, concerning diagnosis, as a physician and you see a patient, what are the options? Is it culture? Is it PCR? Is it serology? Is it just symptomology most of the time?
Well, the symptoms are a good start, but there's usually many things that could cause the same symptoms. And so you can't figure this out typically without a laboratory test. And so the first thing is the doctor has to remember to do that. And many doctors where this disease is common learned to practice medicine where it wasn't common. So they haven't learned about valley fever so much. And we actually have a problem with that in terms of getting the physicians, even here where it's very common, to reflexly look for it. One study we recently haven't finished yet, but is well along in urgent cares in Arizona, we found that 5 out of 6 people presenting with a symptom complex of pneumonia were not tested for valley fever. So there's clearly underdiagnosis because the test isn't done. The test that's done most of the time is actually a simple blood test to look for antibodies that the body makes in response to the infection. And that can be done by anybody, really. It's really not done by them, but you can get the blood specimen and send it to the reference lab. But there, that becomes a problem too, because many places like urgent care or emergency rooms don't like to do tests whose results don't come back before the patient leaves the clinic. They want to have it all tied up with a bow, because if the test comes back and the patient isn't there, they have to find the patient, and some patients just are hard to find. And so there's a little bit of inertia there, but certainly doing the test more. And if we had a test and we're interested in trying to develop one that could be done right there in the clinic, rather than sending the blood to a reference laboratory where the result comes back days, if not weeks later, would be just a godsend. If we could tell the patient within an hour, we have an answer, and here's what's going on.
The treatment, is it your typical antifungals, and how successful is it?
So we're happy to have the drugs that we do have, because sometimes we really need them very badly. But they have limitations. So the antifungals that we use are drugs in almost all cases that were developed to treat other fungal infections. There is essentially no currently used antifungals that have FDA approval specifically for the treatment of valley fever.
Mm.
They were developed for Candida or Aspergillus or something else,
Sure.
Cryptococcus, diseases fortunately many of your listeners won't know the names of, but these are other worldwide fungal infections that the diseases were needed treatments for. And we found that those drugs also work for valley fever. As I said, none of them cure this disease. So they inhibit the fungus from growing, and that's good because the inflammation the fungus causes, that the valley fever fungus causes, calms down, and you can actually feel quite good as a result of that. But if you stop treatment, in some patients, it just comes back. And there's now interest in more drugs, but think of the fact that valley fever really impacts very intensely only a very small part of the country. And as such, the market for developing drugs is a small market. Yeah. And to get a company interested in spending what it takes, the investment to develop a product that is going to have a small user base is a hard sell. And part of what you mentioned, the Forward Act, part of what is in the Forward Act are some incentives to try to change that equation to make it more attractive for pharmaceutical companies and vaccine manufacturers to think about helping with patients with valley fever.
Yeah. Now, valley fever, in addition to humans, it's a pathogen for a number of animals, and particularly dogs, I believe.
Yeah.
What's the story with that?
Well, in fact, our center, Lisa Schubitz at the Valley Fever Center for Excellence, has done prospective studies which shows very clearly the dogs in Tucson have 3 times as high a chance of getting infected. And they have the same problems we do, and many of them get very sick because the frequency of the disease is so high. And that's actually been sort of useful for human medicine as well, because anything that we find that's good for dogs very possibly would also be good for human medicine. And that has been specifically shown with our interest in a vaccine to prevent this disease completely. And the fact I was saying most people actually get over this and become immune suggests that a vaccine really could work. And a vaccine that was discovered here at the University of Arizona is now, because of a public-private partnership between a veterinary company and the NIH, is in development to become a vaccine to prevent valley fever in dogs. And we're now thinking early in 2023, we may have a product that veterinarians will be able to use to give to pet owners, dogs, to prevent valley fever. And this is really exciting. But the reason the NIH supported the idea of a vaccine for dogs was that it would be a proof of concept that this vaccine should go further into human trials. And we're actually working on that as well with vaccinologists that are very, very skilled in human vaccine development. And that's very exciting as well.
Like I said in the intro, members of the Congressional Valley Fever Task Force, and I was telling Dr. Galgiani off the air that I didn't know such a thing existed. So that's an amazing thing. They introduced some legislation last week. It's the Forward Act, and it's designed to advance efforts to combat valley fever in the short, the medium, and the long term. Dr. Galgiani, can you talk about the importance of this bill and it's in the battle against valley fever?
I can. I think because valley fever is affecting only a small part of the country, it's easily lost in the shuffle. It's hard to rise to the top of the stack if it's really a major problem for maybe 10 million people. But it's no less a problem for that subset of Americans. And in fact, I think of it as a biohazard, every bit as much as large biohazards around other places in the country. But it is a biohazard. The intensity of this problem in the endemic regions and for visitors who visit these endemic regions is no less than it is for things that have much wider scope around the country. So it deserves attention every bit as much, and for those constituents. And I think there is a task force for valley fever exactly because congressmen from those areas, in particular around the area around Bakersfield and Kern County, and also areas around Phoenix and Tucson, have realized this and have banded together to try to pool their interest to get attention. And I can tell you that NIH has been very supportive of this. They've recognized valley fever as an unmet need for decades, and see the opportunity for making lots of progress here. So when Congress starts to tell them you should do more for valley fever, I think they don't feel that they're being abused. They like that idea and have, I think, responded quite well to that suggestion from congressional leaders. I also think it calls attention not just to valley fever, but to other orphan diseases as well, that these small diseases are very much as much a problem as large diseases for the people who get it. If you get this disease, you get it 100%. And it's a big disease for you. And actually, people who are interested in precision medicine, that is, understanding exactly the details of why each individual person gets one or another disease, like breast cancer, that's a big disease in essence, but in fact, it's many diseases, and it'll be, as we learn that more and more, it becomes fragmented into a lot of small diseases. So the real nature of medicine is going to be not more big diseases, but all of these big diseases are all going to become small diseases as we learn exactly what causes them. So what we're doing in terms of directing traffic and resources towards valley fever may become the model that probably is going to be used across the board for diseases in general.
Do these members of Congress in this task force, do they seek your consultation?
Well, I've been happy to give them information when they've asked us to, and they certainly want to know the details. They, I think, are trying to be data driven and to propose things that would be useful. So I did know about this bill. It's a resubmission. It was submitted before COVID the first time, and this is a second submission. And I think it's been revised as a result of input from many sources.
Good. And let me go ahead and close out with this question. I want to, of course, give you a chance to talk about the work of your organization, the Valley Fever Center for Excellence. The floor is yours, sir.
Well, good. Thank you for showing our website, which is vfce.arizona.edu. VFCE standing for Valley Fever Center for Excellence, and it's at the College of Medicine in Tucson. And it's been in existence now 25 years. We thought it was very appropriate that the land-grant institution, the University of Arizona, take on this problem that, as I say, 2/3 of all U.S. infections occur in Arizona. So we have a special responsibility here to do something about it. And the center, I think, has perhaps better than anywhere else in the country tried to be the advocacy group. It's not that there aren't others, especially in Kern County, also in UCLA, UCS, University of California, San Diego, and University of California, Davis, others at Stanford. So there are other people interested in this disease around the Southwest. But I think we have a special responsibility, and we're pretty focused on this one disease, not so much just in research, although we do a great deal of that here too, but also to actually have physicians do better with the tools we already have. So there's a large education program. We're available to clinicians across the country to talk to them about their patients, because perhaps it's not so common for a physician in Tampa, Florida, to They may not see valley fever as much as we do here, so we're happy to chat with them on the phone about their patients. And we're happy to do it. This problem needs help, and we think we're the right people to try to provide that help.
And good stuff. And for the audience, I will link to the Valley Fever Center for Excellence in the show notes when I publish the podcast. And I want to thank you, Dr. John Galgiani, for sharing your time and your expertise. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Nice to talk with you. I'm glad you're interested.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.